Good evening and thanks for joining us on the Week in Review. I'm Nick Blumberg. A surprise mass immigration arrest sparks fear and protests.
Get out of Chicago! Fuera! Fuera!
Federal agents reportedly detain at least 10 people who thought they were showing up for a routine appointment.
I'm going to always remain hopeful and confident that we can get a deal done that works for the people of Chicago.
As transit funding hangs in the balance, Mayor Brandon Johnson calls on lawmakers to make sure the wealthy contribute their fair share to public transportation.
I'm not going to run away from my background. Just, hopefully I've gotten some wisdom and some judgment out of it.
Former Mayor Rahm Emanuel continues stoking rumors of a presidential run. Meanwhile, the University of Illinois is on edge amid a Trump administration effort to revoke the visas of Chinese students. Health officials warn at-risk groups to limit their time outside as smoke from Canadian wildfires fills the skies. And the good kind of fire, the Chicago fire, unveil an ambitious stadium plan for long vacant land in the South Loop. And now to our Week in Review panel. Joining us are Quinn Myers of Block Club Chicago, Laura Washington of the Chicago Tribune and ABC 7 News, Brett Chase of the Chicago Sun-Times, and Simone Alicea of CityCast Chicago. Let's get right to it. Thank you all for being here. Before we dive into those topics and more, we have to mention 36-year-old Chicago police officer Crystal Rivera, reportedly fatally shot after a foot chase in Chatham last night. Police say she'd been with the department for 4 years. She leaves behind a 10-year-old daughter. Laura Washington, it's a tragedy for her family, for her colleagues. Even at a time when crime is on the decline in the city, how does a killing like this, rattle Chicagoans, maybe change the perception of the city as a place that's becoming safer?
Well, it's a problem, particularly because this is not an isolated incident. She's the fourth officer to be killed in the line of duty in the last several years, and so it creates obviously a lot of unhappiness and anger in the police department. But I think it also can have a negative impact on police-community relations, because clearly this is an example of criminal activity that didn't have to happen. And I think the attitude that many officers have is they can't safely fight crime because the bad guys are not even afraid of them anymore.
That's right, yeah, and I'm sure this is going to be something that we learn much more about in the coming days and weeks. But certainly some very difficult news. Now, as we mentioned earlier, federal agents detained at least 10 people in a very chaotic scene outside a South Loop immigration office this week. Quinn Myers, what do we know? What are the details?
So I believe these people were checking in for a routine appointment, and then they were arrested. And then it sparks this protest and a physical conflict with activists and ICE agents and Chicago alder people. One said he was hit with a baton, I believe. Others said they were shoved. So this is kind of the latest and probably the most high-profile example of people in Chicago trying to fight back against some of these immigration efforts. We've seen other similar things happen in Minneapolis and San Diego, but this is really a high-profile incident, and we don't really know that many details on who exactly was arrested or exactly how many people. ICE has not been forthcoming with that information for this case, or I must say, in general, they haven't really disclosed how many people in Chicago they have arrested for deportation since the big Trump push began about 6 months ago.
And it seems like almost a catch-22 for folks that, they say you have to show up to this appointment, they show up, they're arrested, and if they don't show up, they would likely be a candidate for detention as well. Simone, the mayor says his office is reviewing this arrest. Realistically, is there much he can do to stop immigration actions like this?
Directly, I'm not sure about that. But I think, one thing that some advocates and older people have called for is a review into how CPD responded to the incident. It's sort of a complicated scenario because you have the Chicago police responding to what is a chaotic scene as you would expect them to, right? But you have some advocates who accuse CPD of violating the Welcoming City ordinance. Are they helping ICE? Chicago police say no, that's not why they were there. They were there for crowd control. That was their purpose. I think that's sort of all the city can do is look at its own response to what has happened and analyze it. But I don't know what the city could do to physically or literally stop.
And the
immigration
Latino caucus
enforcement.
of the City Council has called for a hearing on
Right.
CPD's response here to see if they acted in according with the Chicago welcoming ordinance. So we'll see if that happens. There's probably going to be some pushback from some other alder people on whether that should even happen or not.
Yeah, but this really puts the mayor in a bind because the mayor and the governor, because they've both been fierce advocates of the sanctuary city policy. And it's kind of a catch-22, as you point out. Police are supposed to be there to keep order, and if there's a disorderly event, they have to respond. But they're being perceived as helping ICE, and that's something that if you're really a sanctuary city, you don't want to be accused of.
Yeah, apparently there was some report that they were responding to a call of perhaps an officer in distress, that brought them down to the
That
scene.
could certainly be the case. So
Yeah.
what do they do? Do they stand back because they're not supposed to get involved? It's a no-win situation for them.
Yeah. Well, and the Chicago Tribune reported today that ICE has apparently subpoenaed records from Chicago's City ID program, which is open to migrants. Brett Chase, do you expect to see the Trump administration keep trying to find sort of the cracks in Chicago's status as a sanctuary city?
Oh, I think so. I've given up on trying to predict what the Trump administration is going to do, but it's been quite aggressive on all fronts. Whether it's going after a city or a state or a company or an individual. So yeah, absolutely.
The DOJ is still suing Chicago and Cook County and the state of Illinois. So there are all these multi-prong efforts here.
We are very much in the crosshairs, and I expect that to be the case for quite a while. Well, we heard earlier from Mayor Johnson seemingly expressing confidence that Chicago area transit's going to get the funding that it sorely needs. He also seemed, Laura, to take issue with some of the revenue sources state lawmakers proposed that might hit working folks. Does that seem to mirror some of the issues that he's raising?
Well, his mantra from the very beginning is that we need to tax the rich, that the rich aren't paying their fair share. We don't want to burden the working class folks any more than we have to. And I think there were some revenue sources that were considered in Springfield that were rejected last week precisely because they would have really hit people hard, like the dollar, I think it was $1.50 tax on food deliveries. And so I think that the General Assembly and all elected officials right now are very sensitive to not burdening working families in particular with more taxes. But the big question is, where are you going to get these hundreds of millions of dollars that you need to fix the RTA and the CTA? And there don't seem to be any real meaningful revenues outside of additional taxes of some kind.
Well, and especially in such a difficult budget year where we saw lawmakers working right up until the deadline, a little past it, to try and come up with the money that the state needs.
And they didn't come up with the money for public transit. They dealt with the budget, but now they're going to have to come back. And there's going to be even a higher burden, political burden, in terms of the votes that they're going to need to be able to pass something in Springfield.
That's right, 60% margins, not the simple majority. I mean, if they come back in the summer or the fall, Simone, even if they come through with the money, maybe they come through with the, some of the changes to how the system is run, it's going to be a while. I mean, if you're someone who relies on transit to get around, particularly if you're a transit worker, how nervous are you right now about the timeline just dragging on?
I think you're starting to see more and more transit riders, like this is becoming a more salient issue, and they're starting to become more nervous. Because I remember we've been reporting on this fiscal cliff coming for a year now, at least, if not more. Right? Like this has been talked about for years and years. But now all of a sudden you're starting to really see, and of course you have CTA giving the push on 40% service cuts. How many lines is this going to affect? How many stations is this going to affect? And those numbers are really starting to come to bear, I think, for writers. And so, there is some time here, right? The money isn't running out until 2026.
Yes.
So, lawmakers have at least the summer to do something. And I can't imagine they're going to completely just abdicate that responsibility. I'll be curious to see what kinds of creative revenue they find, if any.
Yeah, one would hope they would not completely just give that.
It's got to be so frustrating to neighbors who ride the CTA. The fiscal cliff has been in the news for a solid year. It's been really in the news, and here we are coming down to the wire in the legislature, and nothing happens. I mean, that is a source of frustration for a lot of people with their state lawmakers right now.
Especially when it's not like the public transportation is superb these days. We've had a lot of challenges with service over the last several years since COVID, in terms of the safety, in terms of the cleanliness of the trains and buses, in terms of reliability. And you're telling people now that it's going to get a lot worse. That's not the message people want to hear.
It certainly is not. Okay, here's another potentially unwelcome message. State did away with its grocery tax, but there's been some conversation, Quinn, in Chicago about keeping it around here. What's going on there?
So this is the 1% grocery tax that last year under Governor Pritzker's budget plan, lawmakers approved getting rid of this statewide at the beginning of 2026. But they left the door open to let individual municipalities, re-levy that tax, essentially continue it, right? Apparently over 200 cities and towns have already done this over the state. Chicago is now looking to do the same thing. However, I do think this is going to be a pretty big fight in the city council. A lot of alder people don't want to be slapped with the label. We do have an election coming up not too far away that, putting even a small tax on Chicagoans after what was already a very bruising budget season. But the city and Mayor Johnson's budget team says we need this money. This is going to come up to maybe $80 million, which is a lot of, a big source of revenue, especially because the city is facing a projected $1.1 billion budget hole this year. So I think things are going to get a little messy over this grocery tax. And, as critics point out, it's regressive. If you make $30,000 a year or you make $1 billion, you're paying the same fee. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I can picture the campaign mailers now that alderperson so-and-so raised taxes on Chicagoans. Well, another local institution with a big budget gap, that is Chicago Public Schools, $500+ million. Simone, the school district, the school board, they're trying to figure out how to bridge that gap, including possibly delaying some of the provisions of the new teacher's contract. That's prompted CTU to threaten to sue. Are you surprised the board would float an idea like this so soon after the contract was signed?
I can't say I'm especially surprised, just because I think, the school district and the board are going to look for any way to potentially shore up that budget and close that gap, particularly any way that doesn't involve taking a high interest loan, a potentially risky loan. That was the thing that kind of set the showdown the last time we were talking about the CPS budget crisis, right? The thing that, got CEO Pedro Martinez, why he lost his job, one of many reasons, I suspect. And so it's not super surprising, but I do think it is, it's also unsurprising to see the CTU kind of come out strongly and say, hey, didn't we just agree on this? We spent a year working on this agreement. It took forever. There was, we talked potential strike at some point. Like, this was a really hard fought thing, and now you're going to delay parts of this. It's also not clear, the parts that they're sort of potentially thinking about tweaking or delaying, how much that would actually save, how much that would go toward that $500+ million. But one thing that the school district did say was that they weren't gonna roll back pay increases or some of those big ticket items, but maybe some of these other hires for other staff that were part of that contract.
Yeah, pay increases, you would have to imagine, would be somewhat of a third rail there for them.
Yeah, just the nuclear option.
Well, that would be violating the contract.
Yes.
Explicitly violating the contract. But I think CPS had been messaging or telegraphing during the negotiations and at the end when they finally came to an agreement that they did not have the money to actually pay for this contract. I think they've been saying all along they only had the money for the first year, so this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone.
Right, we agree in principle, but
Yeah.
we may not be able to put it all into practice.
Right.
Well, Brett, we just saw Facebook's parent company Meta strike a deal with a nuclear plant in central Illinois. What's that power going to be used for?
So this is really interesting because it raises more questions than it really answers. There's this rush to be the leader in AI, and the big four is Meta, which is Facebook, Instagram's parent, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. And so you've seen around the country these deals where these companies are trying to figure out how to get power, and because data centers, and especially those to power AI, take lots and lots and lots of energy. Right. So much so that even things that are happening on the East Coast now are affecting our ComEd bills, which by the way went up
on the way
about
up.
11% this month. So Meta doesn't show its hand here. They bought power, and they bought it in terms of kind of like credits. They may not use the power right away. It may be an accounting thing for them to say that hey, we're powering our data centers around the country and around the world with carbon-free energy, and not anything that's contributing to climate change. So that's particularly important in Europe, but it's important to a lot of politicians in the United States. So there's different scenarios that could happen. One is that they might very well build some sort of a data center around Clinton, which is in central Illinois, because the second piece of this deal is that they said they might expand nuclear capacity on that plant, which means a baby nuke kind of. It's like these things are conceptual. They're called small modular reactors, but they can do that if they can. Foot the bill for it, which would mean that they could power something in the vicinity. Right now, they have one big data center in DeKalb, and they can't take that power and transfer it. For one thing, it's just, not to get in the weeds here, but it's 2 different grid systems.
Right.
So stay tuned. It could be something that develops over the next 10 years, but they have, what they're doing basically is they're stepping in after we have, for the last number of years, subsidized that plant to keep it open. It was under an energy bill that was during the Rauner administration, where then owner Exelon was threatening to shut down Clinton and the Quad Cities nuclear plants.
Well, that might be developing over the next 10 years, but developing here in the next couple of years, presidential race brewing already, even though it feels like we just got through one.
We did, because we did.
We did, right. Laura, you had a column this week about sort of the dueling ambitions of former Mayor Emanuel, current Governor Pritzker. Do either of them have a likely path to the White House? Are they kind of elbowing each other out?
Well, they're definitely elbowing each other, and they're sending strong signals, particularly Rahm Emanuel of late. He's been all over the national media hinting that he might run for president. Of course, Pritzker's been making these steps all along. I mean, they're both from Illinois. They're both, very prominent, very powerful folks here in Illinois. I don't know if that necessarily is going to translate on a national level. There's going to be an extreme amount of competition. Probably a dozen or more serious candidates are going to run for president in the Democratic primary. So we'll have to see. But I don't see both of them running. And Pritzker's been kind of out there a lot longer than Emanuel. I think maybe Emanuel is really trying to do more around messaging and strategizing to try to move his party back to the center, because that's kind of the rhetoric that he's been using when he's been out there talking about where the Democrats need to be. So I think he's hoping to maybe have some influence in that way and maybe not necessarily actually run.
Yeah, even if he's not looking to be in the Oval.
Well, I don't think he's just doing it for the good of his party. I think
It's about power.
He likes to have some skin in the game.
Oh yeah, and he can run, but I don't know. He's got a lot of enemies out there and a lot of critics, so I don't know that he would get very far, particularly with the progressive wing of the party.
Well, but if he can push the party in the direction that a president who's amenable to him, sees him as potentially cabinet material, that also works. Well, the Chicago Fire unveiled a plan for a new stadium. This is in the long vacant so-called 78 neighborhood, which is not a neighborhood because there's nothing there, just south of Roosevelt Road. Quinn, given the idea that the construction here would be privately funded, do you think this latest stadium idea we're talking about might actually have legs?
I think it does, especially compared to the plans that were proposed there, which was maybe Jerry Reinsdorf would build a new White Sox stadium. Maybe the Bears would somehow end up there. They're asking for some public handouts. The Fire is not. Joe Mansueto is going to put $650 million of his own money into this project. We are going to see some public money go to this, of course, for infrastructure costs, millions of dollars certainly, under the TIF district that was already created, I think 8 years ago now. So certainly there is going to be some taxpayer dollars, but already this is being received by the public and at City Hall much more favorably than anything the Bears have come up with. And that is certainly because of the private money and not asking for a huge handout. And it's interesting that this is going to 78. That has sat vacant for so long, for decades. The other player was Lincoln Yards. Maybe this would go up between Bucktown and Lincoln Park. I think some of the turmoil that Sterling Bay and Lincoln Yards is going through, that's the developer trying to put that together. They've been selling it off to banks and everything. It's not a great situation. So I think that probably, amongst other factors, steered the Fire to the 78, where this will probably go. We'll see what happens in the next few months.
Yeah, and it kind of seems like the fans are on their side. I've seen a lot of folks supportive of it and saying like, well, Soldier Field's not really a soccer stadium. It would be nice to have a proper stadium there. Well, we heard this week Chicago's Inspector General, they'd been looking into the city's database of gun offenders. This is where people convicted of certain firearm-related crimes are supposed to measure. The watchdog found that it is, quote, incomplete and unreliable. Simone, this sort of puts me in mind of the city's former gang database, which has been decommissioned. I mean, Are these useful tools, or is this sort of, more of an exercise, a demonstration?
Well, they would be useful tools if the data that's being collected is useful, right? Like they're useful tools if the data is good. But it's interesting. The story about the gun offenders registry is theoretically that should be relatively easy to correct. The point is when people are convicted of gun crimes and after sentencing or when they've gone through the process, afterwards they're supposed to come out and register. That should be easy, right? We've been keeping track of these people as they go through the system.
Sure.
But it turns out the issue is that there's conflicting information coming from the city and CPD. The information to just tell these people, hey, you need to sign this and we need to keep track of you, they're not getting that information. And so, it seems like it should be a relatively easy problem to fix of just, hey, can we communicate this better? I will be curious to see if we can get that data, because theoretically, I can see the theoretical use of it all, right? If you have a registry of gun offenders, then that can be useful information, but it's only useful if you actually collect the data.
Yeah, I think the technology term is garbage in, garbage out. You need to have good inputs to get good information out of it. Brett, anybody who has been outside this week has seen and felt the hazy air from those Canadian wildfires. Should we expect this to be our new normal this time of year?
It's funny you should say that, yeah. 2 years ago, that was the message, because this was unprecedented at that point. We're always going to get air pollution warnings throughout the summer for different types of pollution. And usually at the end of the summer, we have the West Coast fire smoke, and it's not nearly as intense as what we saw this week, or certainly not in 2023. 2023, it just opened our eyes to this new world. It is, by almost all accounts, it is because of climate change. We have hotter, drier, conditions in Canada. Canada did not have wildfires years ago. Now we have them. Then they're blowing here. They're blowing Detroit. They're blowing, all over the country. It's something that is, back to like talking about, carbon-free, energy, and we might talk about the renewable bill that didn't get passed this last session. It's all connected. We're trying to mitigate and adapt to climate change at the same time.
Yeah, tell us about that bill briefly. That was another measure that didn't quite make it out of Springfield this session.
Yeah. When Governor Pritzker signed the the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act several years ago, it was designed to just retire those coal plants that were the biggest polluters of any sort of power generator for a century, right? And to bring more wind and solar, and that's not happening. And so what's happening, getting back to like the data centers that are sucking up all this power, well, we don't have enough generation to run these things. So the legislature left without doing anything, and I don't know if there'll be a special session or if it'll just be dealt with in November when they have the short veto session. But it would have also expanded nuclear too. That was another part of that. But definitely getting more wind and solar, and then big battery operations to store power that they can use later during peak times.
Yeah, they've certainly got a laundry list of things that they might want to be addressing in the special session or in the veto session in the fall. Well, before we wrap up, we should mention a longtime investigative reporter, Renee Ferguson, has died at age 75. She was a groundbreaking journalist here in Chicago, more than 20 years at Channel 5. Laura Washington, how will you remember her?
Well, she was the first African-American woman to do investigative reporting on television in Chicago, and investigative reporting has always been seen as this sort of refined, high-level reporting. She broke through and did a number of nationally recognized stories. She also worked as a network correspondent for some time. A revered and very respected journalist in Chicago. After she retired, she became sort of an advocate. She was a spokesperson for Carol Moseley Braun, the former senator, when she ran for mayor. And she was actually a mentor to the former transportation secretary and presidential candidate, Pete Buttigieg. He was an intern for her when she was at Channel 5, and I remember she actually campaigned with him and advocated for him, and she a really good soul who's lost too soon.
Yeah, she was a pretty remarkable person here, and she certainly will be remembered. Well, that is all the time that we have for today, so I'm going to give our thanks to Quinn Myers, Laura Washington, Brett Chase, and Simone Alicea. We're back to wrap things up right after this.
Tonight's presentation of Week in Review is made possible in part by Ann and Rich Carr, BNSF Railway, and Francine and Dr. Anthony Brown. Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Polk Brothers Foundation. Additional support is provided by
And that's our show for this Friday night. You can stream Chicago Tonight and the Week in Review on our WTTW YouTube channel, and you can catch up on any programs you may have missed. Now for the Week in Review, I'm Nick Blumberg. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy, stay safe, and stay informed. Have a great weekend. Okay, this story I did not necessarily have on my bingo card. Graceland Cemetery is temporarily prohibiting dogs because the coyotes that live there are very protective of their newborn pups. Apparently, Urban Coyote Research Project says there are about 2,000 coyotes in Cook County. Does anybody ever see them, hear them?
I've seen them at Graceland. Oh, yeah.
I live by River Park.
They hang out. That's where they live.
And they actually live in the cemetery.
Yeah.
Don't mess with them.
Right. It's funny, I used to live near the St. Boniface Cemetery at like Lawrence and Clark, and you would hear them. Sometimes they would howl when a siren came past like they were dogs. It was unusual. Although I guess I still just don't tend to think of them as existing in an urban environment.
Coyotes, at Northwestern, there was a family of foxes that lived on campus, like just hanging out all the time.
So you had like some little mascots there.
Yeah.
That's something.
I mean, it's wild.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that serves the needs of clients in the Chicago area and throughout the nation.